The morning sun painted the Montana sky in shades of orange and pink, but David couldn't see the beauty anymore. Sitting in his wheelchair on the front porch of his ranch house, he held his twin baby girls close to his chest, feeling their tiny heartbeats against his shirt. At 34 years old, he never imagined his life would take such a dark turn. Just 3 years ago, David was riding horses across these same fields, herding cattle with the confidence of a man who had ranching in his blood. The 200-acre spread had been in his family for generations. His grandfather built the original barn with his own hands back in 1952, and his father expanded the operation throughout the 70s and 80s. David grew up believing he would pass this land down to his own children someday. Everything changed on a cold February morning 2 years ago. David was checking on a pregnant cow in the far pasture when his horse stepped into a hidden hole and went down hard. The fall crushed 3 vertebrae in David's lower back, and the doctors delivered the news that would shatter his world. He would never walk again. The months that followed were the hardest of his life, learning to navigate his own home in a wheelchair was frustrating enough, but watching his ranch slowly fall apart broke his heart. He couldn't ride out to check on the cattle anymore. He couldn't fix broken fence posts or load hay bales. Simple tasks that used to take him minutes now took hours, if he could manage them at all. His wife, Lisa, tried to be supportive at first. She helped him with physical therapy and even attempted to take over some of the ranch work. But as the medical bills piled up and their savings disappeared, the stress began to tear their marriage apart. David could see the resentment growing in her eyes every day. She never said it out loud, but he knew she blamed him for the accident, for their financial troubles, for the life they had lost. When Lisa discovered she was pregnant with twins, David thought it might bring them closer together. He dreamed of teaching his children to love the land the way he did, even from his wheelchair. But Lisa saw only more responsibility and more expenses they couldn't afford. She became distant and cold, spending more time in town and less time at home. The twins arrived on a snowy December night. David fell in love with his daughters the moment he saw them. Little Amy had her mother's dark hair and serious expression, while her sister Beth came into the world with blonde curls and a feisty cry that made the nurses laugh. David promised himself he would find a way to give them the life they deserved, no matter what it took, but Lisa had already made her decision. 3 weeks after the babies were born, David woke up to find a note on the kitchen table. Lisa had packed her bags and left during the night, taking nothing but her clothes and her car. The note was short and cruel. "I can't do this anymore. I never signed up to be married to a cripple or to raise babies in poverty. Don't try to find me." David sat in his wheelchair, reading those words over and over while his infant daughters slept in their cribs upstairs. The woman he had loved for 8 years, the woman he had married in the same church where his parents were wed, had abandoned her own children without a second thought. The next few months became a blur of sleepless nights and impossible challenges. David learned to change diapers from his wheelchair, to prepare bottles with shaking hands, to comfort crying babies when his own heart was breaking. His older sister came to help when she could, but she had her own family to care for 2 hours away. Most days, David felt completely alone. The medical bills kept coming. The hospital wanted payment for the twins' delivery. The physical therapy clinic sent reminder notices every week. David's insurance covered some expenses, but the copays and deductibles were crushing him. He sold his best breeding bull to pay for Lisa's medical bills from the birth. He pawned his father's watch to buy formula and diapers. Meanwhile, the ranch was falling apart around him. Without proper maintenance, fence lines sagged and broke. Cattle wandered onto neighboring property, causing problems with his neighbors. The hayfields grew wild with weeds. David watched helplessly as everything his family had built slowly crumbled. The bank started calling in March. David was 3 months behind on his mortgage payments, and they wanted answers he didn't have. He explained about the accident, about Lisa leaving, about trying to care for twin babies alone, but the loan officer just repeated the same phrases about payment schedules and default procedures. By April, the foreclosure notice arrived. David had 30 days to bring his mortgage current or lose the ranch. He needed $18,000, money he simply didn't have. He called everyone he could think of. He begged his sister for a loan, but she had already helped as much as she could. He contacted distant relatives who barely knew him. He even swallowed his pride and called Lisa's parents. But they hung up on him. The worst part wasn't losing the ranch, though that felt like losing his identity. The worst part was what would happen to Amy and Beth. The social worker who came to visit made it clear that David's situation was concerning. A disabled single father with no income and no home was not an ideal environment for infant twins. She explained in her clinical voice. "We're not trying to punish you," she said, sitting across from him in his living room while the babies played on a blanket. "But these children need stability. They need proper care. Have you considered that they might be better off with a family that can provide for them?" David felt sick listening to her words. Better off? These were his daughters, his flesh and blood. He had been caring for them alone for months. He knew every sound they made, every expression on their tiny faces. He loved them more than life itself, but doubt crept into his mind during the long, dark nights when Amy cried with colic and Beth needed feeding every 2 hours. Maybe the social worker was right. Maybe his girls deserved better than a broken-down ranch and a father who couldn't even walk. Maybe love wasn't enough when you couldn't provide the basics: food, shelter, security. The auction date was set for the first week of May. David would have to sell everything: the cattle, the equipment, the land, even the house. The bank would take whatever money the sale brought in, which probably wouldn't be enough to cover his debts. After that, he would have nowhere to go and no way to support his daughters. Local gossip made everything worse. David could hear what people were saying around town. Some folks felt sorry for him, but others whispered that maybe it was for the best. "Those babies need a real family," he overheard at the feed store. "It's not natural for a man in a wheelchair to raise children alone." As the auction day approached, David spent his evenings sitting on the porch with Amy and Beth, watching the sunset over the fields his family had worked for 3 generations. He told his daughters stories about their great-grandfather, about the cattle drives and harsh winters and good harvests. He promised them he would fight to keep them together. Even though he had no idea how, the night before the auction, David barely slept. He held his daughters close, memorizing their faces, wondering if this would be their last night together as a family. Tomorrow, everything would change, and he was powerless to stop it. The auction day arrived like a thunderstorm that had been building on the horizon for weeks. David woke up at 5 in the morning, not because he set an alarm, but because he couldn't sleep anymore. His twin daughters, Amy and Beth, were still, sleeping peacefully in their cribs, unaware that this might be their last morning in the only home they had ever known. David wheeled himself to the kitchen and made coffee with trembling hands. Through the window, he could already see trucks pulling up the long driveway. The auction company had arrived early to set up their equipment and organize all the items that would be sold. His life's work was about to be scattered to the highest bidders. By 8 o'clock, the yard was buzzing with activity. The auctioneer, a loud man with a thick mustache, was testing his microphone and setting up folding chairs for the crowd that would soon arrive. Workers were arranging David's farming equipment in neat rows, putting price tags on everything from his grandfather's old plow to the hay baler he had saved up. 2 years to buy? David dressed the twins in their best outfits. That morning, Amy wore a little pink dress that his sister had bought for her, and Beth had on yellow overalls with tiny flowers embroidered on the pockets. He wanted them to look their best, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. Maybe he thought if people saw how beautiful and well cared for his daughters were, they might understand that he was a good father despite everything. The social worker, Mrs. Henderson, arrived at 9:30 sharp. She was a thin woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she always carried a clipboard like it was attached to her arm. David had met with her several times over the past month, and each conversation had made him more anxious about his daughter's future. "Good morning, David," she said, her voice professionally pleasant but cold. Are you ready for today? David wanted to scream that no, he wasn't ready to watch his entire life get sold off piece by piece. He wasn't ready to lose his home. He definitely wasn't ready to potentially lose his children. But instead, he just nodded and adjusted Amy in his lap. The foster family I mentioned is here today, Mrs. Henderson continued, glancing at her clipboard. The Johnsons. They're wonderful people, David. They've been trying to adopt for years, and they're specifically interested in taking both girls together. They understand how important it is to keep twins from being separated. David's chest tightened. He had heard about the Johnsons before. They were a young couple from the city with good jobs and a big house. On paper, they could give Amy and Beth everything he couldn't: financial security, a stable home, college funds, family vacations. Everything except the one thing that mattered most to him. They weren't their father. I know this is hard, Mrs. Henderson said, sitting down in the chair across from him. But you have to think about what's best for the girls. The Johnsons can provide them with opportunities you simply can't offer in your current situation. Before David could respond, cars started pulling up the driveway. The auction was set to begin at 10, and people were arriving to look over the items before the bidding started. David recognized some faces from town, neighboring ranchers, local farmers, people he had known his whole life. Some nodded sympathetically. When they saw him, while others avoided eye contact entirely, his sister Jenny arrived with her husband Tom and their 2 teenage sons. She had driven down from Helena to be there for moral support, though they all knew there was nothing she could do to stop what was happening. Jenny's eyes were already red from crying when she hugged David and took Beth from his arms. I wish we could help more, she whispered. If we had the money, we would buy everything back for you. David knew she meant it. Jenny and Tom had already helped as much as they could over the past year, paying for groceries and baby supplies when David's money ran short. But they had their own kids to think about, their own mortgage and bills to pay. David couldn't ask them to sacrifice their family security for his dot. The crowd grew larger as the morning went on. David recognized the Millers from the next ranch over, probably looking to buy some of his cattle. Old Pete from the feed store was examining his tractor, running his hands over the engine like he was checking out a used car. Even some people David didn't recognize had shown up. Drawn by the newspaper ad for the auction, the auctioneer called for attention at exactly 10 o'clock. His voice boomed across the yard as he explained the terms of the sale and started with the smaller items. David's grandmother's quilts went first, selling for less than the cost of the fabric. Then came the furniture from the house: his father's desk, his mother's china cabinet, the rocking chair where he had spent countless nights feeding his daughters. Each item that sold felt like another piece of his heart being ripped away. These weren't just possessions. They were memories, connections to his family's history. The dining room table where he had eaten Sunday dinners as a child sold for $60. His mother's sewing machine, which still worked perfectly, went for $20-5. David held his daughters close as the bidding continued. Amy was fussing a little, probably picking up on the tension in the air, while Beth seemed fascinated by all the people and activity around her. He tried to memorize every detail of this moment, the weight of their little bodies against his chest, the way Amy's hair curled around her ears, Beth's tiny hand gripping his finger. The farm equipment came next, and the bidding became more competitive. David's hay baler sold for $3,000, about half of what he had paid for it. His best tractor went for $8,000, which was actually more than he had expected. Maybe there would be enough money from the sale, too? Pay off some of his debts, after all. But then came the moment David had been dreading most. The auctioneer announced that they would now be selling the livestock, starting with the cattle. These weren't just animals to David. They were individuals he had cared for, some since they were calves. He knew their personalities, their quirks, which ones were gentle and which ones were troublemakers. His prize bull, Thunder, was the first to go. David had bought Thunder as a young bull 5 years ago, and he had been the foundation of David's breeding program. The bidding was fierce, and Thunder finally sold for $12,000 to a rancher from 3 counties over. David wondered if Thunder would adapt to his new home, if his new owner would understand that Thunder liked to have his ears scratched and got nervous during thunderstorms. The rest of the cattle followed quickly. His milk cow, Bessie, who had provided fresh milk for his family for years, sold for $800. The young steers he had been raising went as a group. Within 2 hours, his entire herd was gone, loaded onto trailers, and driven away. To new homes. Mrs. Henderson appeared at David's side again as the livestock auction concluded. "The Johnsons are here," she said quietly. "They'd like to meet the girls before we make any final decisions." David looked across the yard and saw a young couple standing near their car, watching nervously. The woman was tall and blonde, probably in her early 30s, and she kept smoothing down her skirt like she was worried about making a good impression. The man beside her was shorter and stocky, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. They looked like nice people, David had to admit. They looked like the kind of parents who would read bedtime stories and help with homework and never miss a school play. They looked like everything he wanted to be for his daughters but couldn't provide. "Not yet," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just give me a few more minutes with them." Maria had never planned to stop at an auction that Tuesday morning. She was driving back to Denver from visiting her aunt in Great Falls, taking the scenic route through the Montana countryside because her doctor had told her that long drives might help with the stress she'd been feeling lately. At 7 months pregnant with her first child, she was supposed to be taking things easy, but sitting still had never been her strong point. The hand-painted sign by the roadside caught her. "Attention, ranch auction today, everything must go." Something about those words made her heart sink a little. She had grown up on her grandfather's small farm outside of Denver, and she knew that everything must go usually meant a family was losing their livelihood, their home, maybe both. Her grandfather, Papa Luis, had always told her that auctions were where dreams went to die. He had attended dozens of them over the years, sometimes to buy equipment he needed, but more often to support neighbors who were going through hard times. "You show up, you bid on something even if you don't need it," he used to say. "It's about respect, Mia. It's about showing people they're not alone." Papa Luis had been gone for 3 years now, but Maria still heard his voice in her head almost daily. As she drove past the auction sign, she could practically hear him telling her to stop, to see if there was anything she could do to help. Her husband Carlos was always teasing her about her soft heart, how she couldn't pass a lemonade stand without buying a cup or ignore a fundraiser for the school band. Maria pulled into the gravel driveway and parked her SUV behind a long line of pickup trucks and cars. The auction was already in full swing, with a crowd of maybe 50 people gathered around tables full of household items and farm equipment. The auctioneer's voice carried across the yard, calling out bids for what looked like an antique dining set. As she walked closer to the crowd, Maria noticed something that made her pause. Sitting slightly apart from the main group was a young man in a wheelchair, holding 2 babies in his arms. He looked to be about her age, maybe early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that were clean but worn. But it wasn't his appearance that caught her attention, it was the expression on his face. Maria had seen that look before. It was the same expression her grandfather had worn during his final hospital stay, when he knew he was losing his battle with cancer, but was trying to stay strong for the family. It was pure, quiet desperation mixed with a fierce determination to protect what mattered most. The babies couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 months old. One was sleeping peacefully against the man's chest, while the other was awake and looking around at all the activity with curious eyes. They were dressed in clean, pretty clothes, and it was obvious that whoever was caring for them loved them dearly. Maria found herself moving closer, drawn by a feeling she couldn't quite explain. She had always been good at reading people. Her job as a social worker in Denver had taught her to notice details that others missed. This man wasn't just attending the auction. This was his auction. These were his possessions being sold, his life being scattered to strangers. "Excuse me," she said to an elderly woman standing nearby. "Is that man the owner of this ranch?" The woman glanced over and nodded sadly. "That's David Thompson. Poor boy lost everything after his accident. Wife left him with those twin babies. And now he's losing the ranch, too. Been in his family for generations. Maria felt her chest tighten. What kind of accident? Horse threw him about 2 years back. Broke his back, paralyzed from the waist down. Couldn't work the ranch anymore? Medical bills piled up, you know how it goes. Banks for closing today. And the babies? The woman lowered her voice. Word is social services might take them. David's been trying to care for them alone, but... She shrugged as if the rest was obvious. Maria looked back at David, who was now gently bouncing one of the crying babies while trying to keep the other one comfortable. Her hand instinctively moved to her own growing belly, where her son was kicking as if he could sense her emotional turmoil. She had spent 5 years working with families in crisis back in Denver. She had seen countless children removed from homes, witnessed the heartbreak on both sides when families were torn apart. Sometimes it was necessary when parents were abusive or truly unable to care for their children. But sometimes it was just about money, about circumstances beyond anyone's control. That's terrible, Maria murmured, still watching David struggle to manage both babies while people bid on his belongings around him. It is what it is, the woman replied. Life ain't fair, especially for folks like him. Least the babies will. Get a good home? I heard there's a nice young couple here today, looking to adopt both girls together. Maria scanned the crowd and spotted them easily, a well-dressed couple standing near a newer car, watching David and the babies with a mixture of hope and nervousness. They looked like good people, the kind who would provide stability and opportunities. But something about the whole situation felt wrong to Maria as the auction continued. Maria found herself unable to focus on the bidding. Her eyes kept drifting back to David, who was clearly struggling but trying to maintain his dignity. At one point, one of the babies started crying loudly, and Maria watched him try to soothe her while keeping hold of her sister, an older woman, who looked like she might be his relative, came over to help. But Maria could see the exhaustion and stress in David's face. The crowd was starting to thin out as the smaller items were sold and people began focusing on the bigger ticket items, the farming equipment and livestock. Maria noticed that some people were giving David sympathetic looks, while others seemed to be avoiding eye contact entirely. A few were even whispering among themselves, and she caught snippets of their conversations. Shame about those babies. One man was saying to his wife, but probably for the best, man in a wheelchair can't raise 2 kids on his own. I heard his wife just up and left one day, another woman added. Who does that? Leaves their own babies. Maria felt anger rising in her chest. These people were talking about David like he wasn't right there, like he couldn't hear their judgments and assumptions. She wanted to march over and tell them that being in a wheelchair didn't make someone less capable of being a loving parent, that single fathers raise children every day, that financial problems didn't automatically make someone unfit, but instead, she found herself walking toward David. She wasn't sure what she was going to say or do, but something was pulling her forward. Maybe it was Papa Luce's voice in her head, or maybe it was her own maternal instincts kicking into overdrive. But she couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. As she got closer, she could see the babies more clearly. They were beautiful. Little girls with bright eyes and chubby cheeks. The one who had been crying was now calm, sucking on her tiny fist and staring up at David with complete trust. The other was trying to grab at his shirt collar, making little babbling sounds that made him smile despite everything. Maria stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure of herself. What was she doing? She was 7 months pregnant, driving through on her way home to Colorado. She didn't know this man or his situation beyond what a stranger had told her, but looking at David holding his daughters, seeing the love and desperation in his eyes, she knew she couldn't just walk away. Excuse me, she said softly, stepping closer to his wheelchair. I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Maria. David looked up at the pregnant woman standing beside his wheelchair, surprised by her gentle approach. Most people had been either avoiding him entirely or speaking about him like he wasn't there. This woman had kind eyes and a warm smile, despite the obvious concern on her face. Hello, David replied, adjusting Amy in his arms. I'm David. These are my daughters, Amy and Beth. Maria smiled at the babies, her heart melting a little at how protective David's voice sounded when he introduced them. They're beautiful, she said, and meant it. How old are they? 7 months, David answered, his voice soft with pride. Amy's the serious one, he nodded toward the baby who was studying Maria with wide eyes, and Beth here is our little troublemaker. Beth was indeed trying to grab everything within reach, including Maria's necklace. Maria laughed and gently moved her necklace out of Beth's curious fingers. I can see that. I'm expecting my first in about 2 months, and I'm already wondering if I'll be able to handle one baby. I can't imagine managing twins. Something flickered across David's face. Pain, maybe, or fear. You learn as you go, he said quietly. They teach you what they need. Maria could hear the auction continuing behind them, but she found herself drawn into conversation with this man who was clearly facing the worst day of his life, yet still spoke about his daughters with such tenderness. I'm sorry, she said carefully, but I couldn't help noticing. Is this your ranch they're selling today? David nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. 3rd generation. My grandfather built most of these buildings with his own hands. He gestured toward the old barn with his chin. My father expanded the herd, modernized the equipment. I always thought I'd pass it on to my girls someday. What happened? Maria asked, then immediately felt bad for being so direct. I'm sorry, that's too personal. It's okay, David said, though his voice was strained. Horse accident. 2 years ago, broke my back. Couldn't work the ranch anymore, medical bills piled up, wife left. He said it matter-of-factly like he was reading a grocery list, but Maria could hear the pain underneath. She left you alone with twin babies? 3 weeks after they were born. David's voice was barely above a whisper. Said she didn't sign up to be married to someone like me. Maria felt anger flash through her, followed immediately by a fierce protective instinct. She had worked with enough broken families to recognize strength when she saw it. And this man was raising 2 healthy, happy babies under impossible circumstances. That took more courage than most people would ever need. So what happens now? She asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. David glanced toward where Mrs. Henderson was standing with the potential adoptive couple. Social services thinks the girls would be better off with a family that can provide for them properly. There's a couple here today who wants to adopt them both. Maria followed his gaze and saw the Johnsons talking quietly with the social worker. They looked like nice people, but something about the whole situation felt fundamentally wrong to her. And what do you think? She asked. David was quiet for a long moment, gently rocking Beth, who was starting to fuss. I think I love them more than life itself, he said finally. I think I've been taking care of them alone for months, and we're doing just fine. I think losing them would kill me. His voice broke slightly on the last words. But, Maria prompted, gently. But maybe love isn't enough when you can't provide a stable home, when you can't afford to send them to college, when you can't even walk them down the aisle at their weddings. The words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them inside for too long. Maria felt tears prick her eyes. This man was being forced to choose between his own heart and what others told him was best for his children. She thought about her grandfather again, about the stories he used to tell about neighbors helping neighbors, about communities that stood together during hard times. Has anyone actually asked you what you want? She said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. David looked at her with confusion. What I want doesn't matter. It's about what's best for Amy and Beth. Says who? Maria challenged. Who gets to decide what's best for your children? Some social worker who's known them for a few weeks? A couple who's never even held them? Or their father, who's been caring for them since the day they were born? Before David could answer, Mrs. Henderson appeared beside them, her professional smile firmly in place. David, I'd like you to meet the Johnsons, she said, gesturing for the couple to join them. Robert and Linda have been looking forward to meeting the girls. The Johnsons approached nervously. Robert was a tall, thin man who worked as an accountant, and Linda taught elementary school. They seemed genuinely kind, but Maria could see the awkwardness in their movements as they tried to figure out how to interact with David. "Hello," Linda said softly, her eyes immediately going to the babies. "They're so precious. Would you like to hold one of them?" David asked, though Maria could hear the reluctance in his voice. Linda nodded eagerly and carefully took Amy from David's arms. Amy immediately started to cry, reaching back toward her father. Linda tried to soothe her, bouncing gently and making soft sounds, but Amy only cried harder. "She's probably just tired," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "Babies can sense when there's a lot of activity around them." But Maria noticed that as soon as David reached out and took Amy back, she calmed down immediately. Beth, still in David's other arm, was watching the strangers with obvious wariness. "They're very attached to you," Robert observed, and there was something almost disappointed in his voice. "We've been together every day since they were born," David said, his protective instincts clearly kicking in as he held both girls closer. Maria watched this interaction with growing frustration. These people were talking about taking David's children away from him like they were discussing a business transaction. The babies obviously knew who their father was, who they felt safe with, who loved them unconditionally. "Mrs. Henderson," Maria said suddenly, causing everyone to turn and look at her. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" The social worker looked surprised but nodded. They walked a few steps away from the group, far enough that David and the Johnsons couldn't hear their conversation. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Maria began, "but I have to ask, have you explored every possible option to keep this family together?" Mrs. Henderson's professional smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, but who are you exactly? Are you a relative?" "I'm a social worker from Denver," Maria said, which was true, though she wasn't there in any official capacity. "And I'm looking at a father who clearly loves his children and has been successfully caring for them for months. What exactly makes him unfit as a parent?" "It's not about being unfit," Mrs. Henderson replied defensively. "It's about stability. He has no income, no home, no support system. The Johnsons can provide these children with opportunities that David simply cannot. And what about love? What about the bond they clearly have with their father? What about the trauma of separating them from the only parent they've ever known?" Mrs. Henderson's jaw tightened. "Sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the greater good of the children involved." Maria felt something snap inside her. Maybe it was her pregnancy hormones? Or maybe it was her grandfather's voice echoing in her head. Or maybe it was just basic human decency, but she couldn't stand by and watch this happen. What if there was another option? She heard herself saying. What if David didn't have to lose his home? Mrs. Henderson stared at Maria with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Maria took a deep breath, her hand instinctively moving to her pregnant belly. She was about to do something crazy, something her husband, Carlos, would probably think she had lost her mind for. But looking back at David holding his daughters, seeing the love and desperation in his eyes, she knew she couldn't walk away. I said, "What if David didn't have to lose his home?" Maria repeated, her voice stronger now. "What if there was a way for him to keep his daughters and stay on his land?" "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a very complex situation," Mrs. Henderson said in her most professional tone. "There are legal issues, financial considerations, and most importantly, the welfare of these children to think about." "I understand all of that," Maria replied. "But what if those financial considerations weren't an issue anymore?" Before Mrs. Henderson could respond, Maria walked back to where David was sitting with the twins. The Johnsons had stepped aside and were talking quietly with each other, probably trying to figure out what was happening. "David," Maria said, kneeling down beside his wheelchair so they were at eye level, "I know this is going to sound absolutely insane, and you have every right to think I'm some kind of crazy person, but I have an idea." David looked at her with exhausted eyes. "At this point, I'm willing to listen to anything." Maria glanced around to make sure no one else could hear them clearly. "My husband and I have been looking for a way to invest in something meaningful, something that would make a real difference. We've been thinking about getting into ranching, but we don't know anything about cattle or farming. Okay, David said slowly, not sure where she was going with this. What if we bought your ranch? Today? Maria continued, her words coming faster now as the idea took shape in her mind. What if we became partners? You know, everything about running this place, and we have the financial resources to make it work. You could stay here with your daughters. Keep doing what you love, and we could learn from you. David stared at her like she had just spoken in a foreign language. You want to buy my ranch? But you don't even know me. You don't know anything about my situation except what some stranger told you. I know enough, Maria said firmly. I know that you're a good father who's been dealt a really unfair hand. I know that your daughters need you, and you need them. I know that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the logical thing to do. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the yard, announcing that they would be starting the bidding on the ranch. Property in 10 minutes. David felt panic rising in his chest. Once that gavel fell, everything would be over. Maria, I can't let you do something like that, he said, though hope was starting to flicker in his eyes despite himself. You don't understand how much money we're talking about. The ranch is worth at least $300,000, maybe more, plus all my debts. My husband and I can handle it, Maria said simply. Carlos inherited his family's construction business, and we've been very blessed financially. We've been looking for a way to use that blessing to help others. Mrs. Henderson had been listening to their conversation and now stepped forward. Excuse me, but even if what you're proposing were possible, it doesn't address the fundamental concerns about David's ability to care for these children. What concerns? Maria asked, standing up to face the social worker. That he's in a wheelchair? That he's a single father? That he doesn't have enough money? Because if it's the money issue, we just solved that. It's more complicated than that, Mrs. Henderson insisted. David has no family support in the area, no backup care for the children, no experience managing both parenting and a business operation. Then he'll have us, Maria said without hesitation. Carlos and I are about to become parents ourselves. We could learn together, help each other. That's what families do. David felt tears starting to form in his eyes. This woman, this complete stranger, was offering him everything he had thought was impossible. But it seemed too good to be true, too generous to accept. Why? He asked quietly. Why would you do this for someone you just met? Maria smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like her grandfather when he used to tell her stories about helping neighbors during hard times. My grandfather always told me that we're put in each other's paths for a reason. Maybe I was supposed to drive by here today. Maybe I was supposed to meet you and your daughters. She pulled out her cell phone. I'm going to call Carlos right now. If he agrees, and if you want to do this, I'm going to march over to that auctioneer and make a bid on your ranch. David's heart was pounding. Maria, you can't make a decision this big without talking to your husband first. This would change your whole life. Some decisions are too important to wait, Maria replied, already dialing Carlos's number. Carlos? Hi, honey. I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me on this. She walked a few steps away to have a private conversation with her husband. David sat there holding his daughters, hardly daring to believe what was happening. Amy had fallen asleep in his arms, and Beth was playing with his shirt buttons, completely oblivious to the life-changing conversation happening around her. The Johnsons approached hesitantly. David, Linda said softly, we couldn't help but overhear. If there's a chance for you to keep your daughters, we want you to know that we support that completely. Robert nodded in agreement. We've always believed that children belong with their biological parents when possible. If this works out, we're happy for you. David felt overwhelmed by their kindness. These people had driven hours to meet his daughters, had their hearts set on adoption, but they were willing to step aside. Because they could see how much his family meant to him, Maria returned from her phone call, her face glowing with excitement. Carlos says yes. He says if I think this is the right thing to do, then he trusts my judgment. He's actually excited about the idea of learning to ranch. She turned to Mrs. Henderson. So, what needs to happen to make this legal? What do we need? to do to ensure that David can keep his daughters? Mrs. Henderson looked flustered. In 15 years of social work, she had never encountered a situation quite like this. Well, if David has stable housing and a reliable income source, and if there is adequate support for childcare, then theoretically there would be no grounds for removal. Then let's make it happen, Maria said, walking toward the auctioneers. The next hour passed like a blur. Maria's bid on the ranch property was the only serious offer, and she won the auction easily. Carlos drove up from Denver and arrived just as they were signing the initial paperwork. He was a stocky man with kind eyes and a quick smile, and he seemed genuinely excited about their new adventure. Within 6 months, the arrangement had exceeded everyone's expectations. David had found new purpose in teaching Carlos and Maria about ranching, while they provided the financial backing to modernize the operation and expand the herd. The twins, now taking their first wobbly steps, had 2 sets of parents who adored them. Maria and Carlos's son, little Miguel, was born 2 months after the auction, and he grew up thinking of Amy and Beth as his older sisters. The ranch became a place where 2 families had joined together to create something stronger than either could have managed alone. David often looked back on that terrible auction day as the moment his real life began.